Well, coming up on a special edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE. Plus, it is budget proposal day here in the state of California. We'll give you all of the details of what's in that budget proposal.
The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
Honored to have you with us here on a Tuesday, a special edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with ACSA's Executive Director, Dr. Edgar Zazwata. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing Communications. Welcome. Go ahead and jump onto the chat, say hello, and let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, how are you?
Good, Naj. I mean, first of all, I think it's worth mentioning. I know you and your family has been dealing with some stuff that unfortunately it's kind of a common thread here around the state, and in our I know many of our schools have been impacted this week by the weather. I know you and your family were forced to leave your home, given some flooding that we've had here in the area. So hope you're doing okay. Hope you're hanging in there. I mean, if there was any doubt to our viewers, to our members of your commitment, right, amongst everything else you have going on this week, you told many of us this week that. And I remember, for instance, the first day I started ACSA, how much you appreciate budget day on trying to get that information out to our members. So just want to really acknowledge your commitment that you have a lot going on and you're still here with us. So I just hope you and your family are safe, and also to our members, who I know a lot of folks are dealing with, unfortunately, with the impact of these severe storms across the state over the last week.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've lived here in California for 30 years and have never experienced the type of experience that we've had over the past week, 10 days or so. Yes, I finally got back into our house last night after having to evacuate Sunday night. Just incredible storms. My wife, who teaches kindergarten, as you know, down the street, their school is closed now for the second consecutive day. No power over there. So crazy few days here, but happy to be on the lunch break. I'm not exactly sure why I'm like 4 times larger than.
I noticed it, but I was just not going to mention it. But it's for all those times when you give me the unideal camera shot. So you can't always look the best there, Naj. I know you're the professional. Give me at least 1 week here.
I'm going to have to keep moving my chair back as we go. Anyway, folks, it is budget day, budget proposal day. We're going to take you through the numbers here. I want to just kind of set this up for you, because leading into the presentation, which started at 9:15 today, the governor wanted to make it clear that the financial implications, like inconsistency of revenue and such, would impact some of the direction that he and his advisors were taking. Let me give you the numbers, the general numbers here. $297 billion balanced budget with a $223.6 billion general fund budget. He also touted some of the state's budget resilience. We've been hearing about, some budget inconsistency for the past year. $35.6 billion in reserves. The rainy day fund is at $22.4 billion, and there is an $8.5 billion set aside for public school rainy day fund. Now, the numbers that matter to you most here in California public education, we're going to show those to you, especially the Prop 98 funding, which is funded at $108.8 billion. There's a total per pupil spending of $23,723. Also of note, an 8.13% LCFF COLA, the state estimates, that will result in $4.2 billion in additional discretionary funds for schools. Also, to point out in a category that the governor called transforming public education, there's $12.5 billion in learning recovery and learning loss mitigation, $4.7 billion for children and youth behavioral health, $4.1 billion in community schools, $4 billion ongoing for before and after school and summer school programs, and $3.6 billion for special ed. Edgar, you were watching this just like I was, and many members of our governmental relations team, and I'm sure many of our viewers. Your initial look at what the governor has proposed.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway, Naj, is I think it's fair to say, and we've been talking about it both on the lunch break, we talked about it with some of the guests, we've been talking about this at our different events, that there was a little bit of uncertainty going into this January budget proposal. I think what was different here this year, especially over the last number of years, is that we kind of were bracing ourselves a little bit about what are those numbers going to be. Are we going to, given some of the revenue shortfalls that the state had been announcing, would this be a budget that we now wouldn't, the governor would not be able to propose something like funding the COLA at the level that it's been called out there? Also, what was going to mean to some of the programs, some of the previous commitments that had been made, and what would that mean in terms of with these lower revenue numbers? So I think the big takeaway today is that, there's definitely been a bit of a slowdown. But one thing that I think we should know is that for education, the governor and the administration has really called out school funding and try to prioritize it to the extent that maybe some of the other parts of the state budget aren't getting that same protection, right? This 8.1% in the COLA, this commitment to all the programs that had been previously established. I think those are the big ones. There's undoubtedly some sacrifices. There's some things that we're going to have to look at. I think the other piece is that there's not a lot of new programs. I think that had been a theme that we had been calling out here over the last year or so, that, hey, a lot has been put on the plate of our educators. Why don't we make sure we get it right here, what we already have in place, before we put anything more in? And I think the governor has kind of heard that. Some of that is just because they don't have the means really to then go and propose a lot of new programs. But I think this notion of staying the course, really making sure that we fulfill some of those commitments is one of the big takeaways. And undoubtedly, the big caveat we always give, and I usually say this right at the beginning, is this is new. You know, we've had a few conversations with senior members of the governor's administration. We all watched the governor give his presentation. What always happens about this year, we're learning too. We're digging in. It's always devil in the details. So we'll talk about a few things. I know Iván will touch on a few things that'll be our standard answer. We're going to have to dig in. We're going to have to learn more in terms of the details.
And let me ask you this question, because, you know, the governor acknowledged that some of the inconsistency that we've seen revenues wise, there was that discussion last year with the budget, especially at the tail end of the budget. He kind of set it up as we were moving into actually talking about the specific numbers, that really what was proposed here wouldn't or shouldn't surprise anybody, because the LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, has been talking about this as the lead-in to the budget proposal. I think that's probably a good way to set this up. Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the head. I think we were all kind of expecting this. We've been talking about it. The governor's administration has been talking about it. The legislative analyst had been kind of giving some of these warnings, that just what the projections and the forecasts had been. So it really part of the course. I think if anything, if I'm striking a positive tone, that given some of those revenue numbers, we were actually wondering, would they have enough money to fund the COLA? Would they have enough money to really fulfill some of these other commitments? I think the other one piece that's worth noting is that at least right now, they haven't dipped in to the rainy day fund, the education stabilization fund, which I know there'll be a lot of discussion about that, given some of the other methods that they had to make some changes to some previous allocations to be able to fund us at the level that they did. I know that will be a discussion piece. I think it's worth noting that at least at first glance, it's probably prudent to not go into your reserves right away until you really know what's coming ahead of time, right? This could be the beginning of an economic slowdown. We could have bigger challenges next year. So I think this question about what's the fine line of how much do you really try to mitigate that this year, knowing that next year could be a challenging year or beyond.
Yeah, and let me make note of that rainy day fund, that public school rainy day fund, currently $8.5 billion is the number to that. We're going to bring in our guest in just a moment. Want to remind all of you, if you do have questions, we do have our webinar coming up at 3 p.m. with the entire ACSA governmental relations team. They are there to give you additional details as they are working through the budget proposal right now. There's a lot to it. They will be able to answer specific questions for you. That comes up at 3 o'clock. You should have all received a link to that webinar in your email. So go ahead and check your email. It was the same one that promoted our show today. Again, that comes up at 3 o'clock. Let's go ahead and bring in Iván Carrillo. He's ACSA's Governmental Relations Director. Iván, so good to have you here on the show with us today on this special edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Let me just ask you right off the top, your impressions about what you heard from the governor and what this budget proposal looks like.
Yeah, I agree with what Edgar shared. I think by and large, it's a positive reaction to what's being proposed by the governor. Considering the shortfall for the overall budget is what it is, I think we're insulated from that, given Proposition 98 and the guarantee, given now even increases of that we've seen with the recent Arts Initiative, Prop 28. So yeah, I feel really positive because there's a alignment with priorities that our members, that educational leaders and ACSA have been beating the drum about. And so fully funding the COLA, recognizing the importance of that, and providing as much discretionary funding to the field as possible. So that being proposed. One thing I will note, Naj, and just the slide that was up there earlier and the governor's messaging around this budget being transformative for schools, is that those proposals primarily were ones that had been established in years past. And so these aren't new commitments that are being made. This is fulfilling commitments and promises that were made to the field previously. And so we've been talking about the importance of that as well, about recognizing that the successful implementation of these programs is dependent on the money being there to support their implementation. And so we're happy to see that the governor is proposing to continue to fully fund those programs that were established previously.
Iván, was there any particular piece of this budget proposal from the governor's presentation or from what you've been reading since the presentation ended and our show here that started 12 minutes ago? Anything that stood out to you specifically from this?
Yeah, there's a couple. So probably the most notable one that stood out is proposed change to the local control funding formula. We've seen the local control funding formula be preserved in its original design since its establishment. But the governor is proposing in what is being described or termed as an equity multiplier. This is one of those proposals that there's very little details that are provided in terms of how this equity multiplier will work in practice. But it's clear from the description in his press conference, it's clear from the summary that the intent is to direct additional resources. The amount is $300 million to support the students with the highest needs. And so we've had some conversations, and there is rumor that the funding will be directed to schools with the highest concentrations of students that are high poverty. But we don't know that for sure. We're looking to get those details and confirmation of that. Again, this is one of those areas that we'll be looking to dig into because the devil's in the details here. But one thing is clear is just this whole overall tone about, can we do more? Should the state ought to do more in terms of closing persistent achievement gaps, persistent opportunity gaps that have been slow to close? Can we accelerate that? These gaps that have been long-standing. So that's probably the most notable one, Naj.
Iván, if I'll just chime in a little bit on that piece. And I saw some inquiries from Dr. Magdaleno, from others about this equity piece, right? And I think this will, aside from the COLA and the funding pieces, I do think that this is probably one proposal that, as we get all of the details, will probably spark the biggest amount of conversation. And frankly, aside, I mean, they call out 300 million. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a huge piece. So there's the funding piece. And I think Iván has articulated correctly just what we're hearing, what with the preliminary conversations we've had with some officials. The other piece of this pie, which I think is going to at least garner some attention, is some proposed maybe changes to the accountability system that they also are going to go along with this. One of the context pieces that I think we should at least know that the governor spoke to, that they allude to in the summary, is the achievement of African-American students. There's been this longstanding conversation here in the legislature about some proposals about should we change LCFF to make sure that we capture that. And there's been some, there's been legal considerations about how you could do that. And so it's clear that they're trying to at least address this conversation. Maybe not exactly as that had been defined in the legislative proposals, but that they're trying to do something here. And so aside from the money, I think the piece that we'll be looking out for is, what is this going to mean in terms of our LCAPs? I mean, there's been some discussion about calling out what actions that for schools that may be struggling with student groups that are in the very low category in the dashboard, that the state may ask us to call out our actions for those students a little bit more explicitly, given that where we're at right now with the LCFF, it's all at the LEA level. So again, like not to beat a dead horse, we don't have all the details. This is based on some information that we've received. I think this is where we're going to have to read all the fine detail of the legislative language, but I'm guessing that this will be an area of discussion as we move along.
Yeah, you know what? Let me add to that, and folks, we just happen to be focusing on one aspect of this because, as both Iván and Edgar have mentioned, the devil's in the details on this equity multiplier. It's just a piece of this budget proposal, but it takes me back, and Iván, I'll ask you about this. There will probably be some level of educating that needs to be done inside the state capitol. I'm reminded of when there was the debate inside the state capitol over distance learning versus independent study, and what was the difference between the two, because there were a number of lawmakers who didn't really have a grasp of the difference between the two. Do you foresee that there's going to have to be a level of education with lawmakers about what the equity multiplier is and the details of it, especially because we've made mention here, there's a lot we don't know about this?
Yeah, Naj, there's always the need to educate policymakers on the nuances, on the implications, on the details of the LCFF and just other educational proposals, policy proposals. But this year there's greater emphasis, and we talked about this on the show a number of times. Just when you have such turnover in the legislative makeup, and you have so many legislators who don't have that legislative history and direct connection to and ties to things like the LCFF. So certainly there's going to be added need and emphasis on making sure policymakers, particularly the new ones, have a grasp and an understanding of the policy and what's being proposed. And Naj, if I can take a moment to just hit on one other thing that was notable as well, it kind of touches on what you just asked also, is there is a proposal to reduce one-time funding allocation that was included in last year's budget. So our members will recall that in last year's budget, there was a $3.5 billion one-time allocation that was deemed, or that was coined the arts, music, instructional materials, discretionary block grant. So this was by and large discretionary funds that schools were able to utilize to serve their communities. And so the governor is proposing reducing that $3.5 billion by $1.2 billion. So it's our understanding that the first half, 50% of these dollars went out already to the field, but that second payment that was expected by the field to be made in the spring, now that's being called into question, and that the overwhelming majority of that again is being proposed to be pulled back and not be allocated. So this is notable. This is, I mean, I think hearing from our members the implications of this, and I think it's assumed and expected by me and by members of the team that given that the promise was made back in the fall, given that LEAs and schools were told the dollar amount that they were going to receive and when they'd receive it, that those were budgeted for, that those were planned for, and so making sure that that policymakers and the administration understand this as well, even though you have on the other side a significant investment being made with fully funding the COLA. And so we'll be keeping that front and center and making sure that our members are engaged in those conversations as well.
All right, Iván, we know that you've got a budget briefing with the governor's office coming up in a matter of moments, and you and the rest of the team are working towards our 3 o'clock webinar. So we'll let you get back to it. Iván Carrillo, ACSA's Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. Iván, good to see you. Thank you for being with us today. Edgar, as we prepare for that webinar today at 3, and I would assume you'll be listening in on the governor's office's presentation beginning at 1 today. Your final thoughts on what you're seeing from this budget proposal and kind of maybe next steps, not just for ACSA, but our great members in the field.
Yeah, as I say, I think every year it's even when we're always asked for these instant reactions, right? And we give the instant reactions, and the caveat that I gave earlier that we're still digging in through everything. With all that being said, it's our job to nitpick, right? It's our job to really find those places where the state, well-intentioned, may put something out that actually maybe not make the most sense in terms of in practice and implementation. And I think us now, as we start to put some sunshine on some of these proposals, that's the place that we're going to be wanting to get some feedback from our members. I think Iván hit on a great example there, that the state reversing course and saying, hey, here's some discretionary money for arts that actually could have been used for anything else. Some districts may have chosen to go in a different direction with those dollars. And I think the state is now justifying pulling those back because of the initiative that just passed. That's going to bring in a good amount of resources for arts. I think those are the places that we're going to have to get some perspective. How is this going to play out in the field? And it's a process. We have the legislative process that goes for 5 months here. The May revise, they get a chance to rework some of these proposals. So it's something that we're all accustomed to. But overall, I think it's the first step in the process. I think we take some solace in some of the things that the governor has proposed, and we'll dig in on some of the pieces that may be a little bit more problematic. I think we'll wait and see. I saw a couple of the questions about, specifics on a couple of other fronts. We will just ask, and this is not supposed to be just a big teaser. Like we said, we're still digging into this, but by 3 o'clock, we'll go deep dive in terms. I saw a question about SELPA. I saw a couple other pieces on other funding streams. So hopefully folks can join us at 3 o'clock. If not, we'll also make that available to our folks after the fact. But the team is, as you stated, Naj, they're working hard right now to kind of analyze as much information as we have. We have a couple briefings here with the governor coming up. We usually get a little more information as well from that.
Yeah, there's a lot to do. Sam and William, we saw your questions in there. We'll pass those along to the GR team. Folks, we are closing in on 1 o'clock, so we will let you get back to it. Edgar and I not on the air tomorrow as our Every Child Counts Symposium in Southern California gets underway, but we are on next week, our regularly scheduled 1 p.m. Wednesday ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We've got a team of budget experts in next Wednesday to take more of your questions. Until then, have a great rest of the day, rest of the week. We'll see you at 3 o'clock today. Have a great rest of the day.